Welcome back to another discussion on the Lord's Recovery Unchained. As a reminder, the co-workers in the Lord's Recovery have admitted that Witness Lee's teachings are not infallible, so we're testing the teachings in the local church to see if we should hold fast to them as biblically true or discard them as biblically false. So today we're going to talk about questions in the Lord's Recovery. There is a common conception that questions are not allowed in the Lord's Recovery, so we'll start by jumping right into where this idea comes from by looking at what Witness Lee said in the ministry. He said, "The serpent comes to us in the form of a question mark. A question mark is shaped like a snake standing upright." Both of these statements are referencing the serpent in the Garden of Eden, where the serpent asked Eve, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" Witness Lee said that this question stirred up Eve's mind and poisoned her by putting a doubt, a question mark, into her. The message is very clear, not only to adults, but particularly to vulnerable, impressionable church kids who hear this teaching as young people. That message is, questions are shaped like the snake. Questions are of the devil. Unfortunately, this is a great way to silence people, adults and kids alike. It's a great way to shut them up. But the teaching doesn't even make much sense anyway. I mean, I guess you could draw a snake to be in the shape of a question mark, but obviously snakes spend most of their life very much not in that shape, and much more in the shape of I don't know, a coil or a squiggly line. Saints and listeners, let's not forget the terrible logic behind this teaching. The reasoning here is the shape of the punctuation mark used in English to grammatically symbolize a question could sometimes be sort of shaped like a certain animal. That animal did a bad thing in the Bible, therefore questions themselves are bad. By that same token, we could say that the shape of an exclamation mark is like a big long fish or whale, and a whale was what swallowed Jonah for 3 days, therefore any exclamations or commands are of a man-eating sea monster. Obviously, this kind of reasoning is not only childish, but is a horrible logical fallacy. We all know that we don't come to biblical conclusions about the sinfulness or lawfulness of an action based on the shape of grammatical punctuation marks. And not only that, remember, the book of Genesis is in the Old Testament. The Old Testament was written in ancient Hebrew. Ancient Hebrew did not have punctuation marks, and it even lacked written vowels and spaces between words. It certainly did not have what we know as a question mark. This message, if it really was true, that question marks equals a snake shape equals questions are of the devil, would have been completely lost on them. Our English punctuation marks today have nothing to do with any of this. Okay, what's on the screen is obviously not the original Hebrew, but you get the point. And I could get a little bit silly here and ask, what does this lesson mean for Spanish speakers? Do half of the snakes in Mexico and Spain spend their lives on their heads? I mean, don't let yourself be made dumb here, saints and listeners. Let's use our sober mind to discern bad reasoning. Seriously. If you want to ask a question, but the thought that a question mark is shaped like a snake standing upright comes to your mind, and that thought causes you to keep your mouth shut instead, just be aware that you are an otherwise intelligent human being whose behavior has just been controlled because you've been put to shame and shut up by the shape of a punctuation mark. If idols are nothing and meat offered to idols is therefore nothing, I can guarantee you that punctuation marks are all the more nothing to give a second thought about. And another big problem with this teaching is that the question wasn't even the issue in the Garden of Eden. First of all, the question didn't actually throw Eve off at all. She responded that they were not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It was the serpent's big fat lie mixed up with some truth that he said next that caused the problem. It wasn't his question that did it, but his intentional deceptive falsehood that followed. Secondly, anyone using the brain God gave them knows that a mere 9 verses later in that same chapter, God himself came to Adam and Eve with a question. He asked them, "Where are you?" Obviously, questions are not the problem. And by the way, the Apostle Paul peppered his epistles with questions to the saints in the churches, and sometimes kind of sarcastically too. Jesus asked his disciples questions, his disciples asked him questions back. Questions are flying around all over the place. So what usually happens with this kind of teaching is that as long as you're not questioning the ministry and you're restricting your questions to anything except the ministry or the associated teachings and practices in the local church, the boat doesn't get rocked. Affirmation of the ministry and critique of everything else, right? But as soon as your questions are directed at the ministry or the practices in the Lord's recovery, oh boy, problems. Because there really are issues with Witness Lee's ministry and with local church teachings and practices that actually do need to be questioned and do need to be addressed. And if you happen upon one of those real issues and start asking real questions, which is okay to do, by the way, all of a sudden, this is the kind of response you might get. Questions are shaped like the serpent. You need to get out of your mind. And that's it. You are shut down. How can you respond to that? Questions are demonized, and you just got demonized too, since you were apparently wrong and bad and evil enough to even entertain a question. And even though this example describes another person saying these things to you, this teaching is so effective that oftentimes you say it to yourself in your own head and shut your own thinking down before you can even get a question out of your mouth. But the teaching is wrong and not a biblical teaching. Questions are not of the devil. In order to be able to test all things and examine the scriptures, questions are a mandatory part of that. And yes, we actually do even have to ask questions about God's word. That's how you study it. That's how you learn and understand it better. You can't hardly test anything without asking questions. Christians are supposed to be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks us to give the reason for the hope that we have. How are we supposed to be expected to give an answer if questions are of the devil? Come on, be of a sober mind here. You know this teaching doesn't hold up to scrutiny. We have to be careful, saints and listeners, that we don't demonize a positive thing just because some misuse it. And if the logic doesn't hold up and questions are not of the devil, then that shame and condemnation that they just put upon you for asking questions can be sent right back onto them for their misusing the Word of God to control you and silence you. Because of this teaching's harmful effects, and because it is not according to the Bible, it is not one anyone should hold fast to. Now, some of you listening might be getting tense and agitated and wanting to say something like, "Wait a minute, I was in the full-time training and I asked lots of pointed questions of the trainers or co-working brothers." Or some of you might be wanting to say, "Hey, haven't you seen all the fireside chat question and response videos from the coworkers on YouTube?" Well, of course, but if you pay attention, any of the questions that touch upon actual sensitive local church issues that are allowed through get answered in ways that don't answer the question, that cannot stand up to scrutiny, that distract from the heart of the question and don't actually acknowledge the truth. I'm serious. Some shift uncomfortably in your seat type questions were allowed through in some of the fireside chat Q&R videos, and yet if you pay attention to how the coworkers respond, they either condemn the questioner as in their mind or in the wrong realm, and never acknowledge the plain truth found in the question, or their response contains claims that are contradictory when paired next to each other, or they distract with a lot of flowery and grandiose language that doesn't address the question at all. And that's why controversies about the local church still continue. That's why the coworkers keep making new websites, because the answers to these kinds of questions simply don't address the actual problems. Seriously, We've got contendingforthefaith.org, afaithfulword.org, afaithfulwitness.org, and now shepherdingwords.com. Saints, healthy churches do not need numerous websites to address all the problems they have. The Shepherding Words website alone has over 70 articles on 70 different major problems. This may be what you are used to, but this is not even remotely normal for a healthy church. Most healthy churches are busy preaching the gospel, serving their community and loving people, and not mired in a half-century of problems and accusations and turmoils and rebellions and storms and fermentations. At some point, you have to acknowledge that one of the fruits of the Spirit, peace, simply isn't present in the Lord's recovery as a whole. And speaking of those websites, fortunately for us, the coworkers have actually written an article on their latest website, shepherdingwords.com, about this very subject of questions entitled Questions versus Questionings, which can be found here. Much of the article is consumed with delineating between quote-quote proper and improper questions, between questions and questionings. They bring in things like ulterior motives, or questions that don't seek an answer but instead seek to ensnare, or being diseased with endless questionings. On the positive side, they do acknowledge that Witnessly appealed to believers to examine the ministry. They then close the article with a short exclamation that they hope the Lord's recovery would be filled with quote-quote proper seeking questions. There's a lot going on in the article. So let's look at an example. They say, questions seek an answer, questionings do not. The Gospels show that many questions can be insincere. For example, the religious leaders among the Jews posed questions to the Lord Jesus in their efforts to ensnare him. Such questions were improper, and the Lord would not answer his questioners on their own terms. Well, it's a little ironic that they used Mark 11 as an example of improper, insincere questions that are intended to ensnare, because we can see in verses 29 through 32 that Jesus himself responded to the Jews' questions by asking them a question that was, you guessed it, intended to ensnare. In verse 31, the Jews discussed among themselves how they should answer Jesus, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will ask, then why didn't you believe him?" And in verse 32, they say, "If we say of human origin, well, they feared the people, for everyone held that John was really a prophet." Jesus' question shined light on them, exposed their hypocrisy and lies, and ensnared them in their own game. Because the truth is, saints and listeners, that a question does not have to be a quote-quote proper question or have the sole intent of guileless learning to be appropriate or effective. Sometimes there are people and behaviors and actions that should be ensnared and exposed. And guess what? The coworkers are not above this in any regard. Questions absolutely can be used to ensnare or, to make a point. Questions can be used to show the illogic of someone's claim, to show the flimsiness of a belief, and to show the hypocrisy of someone's position. These are very much perfectly acceptable ways of using questions. The coworkers have made an arbitrary rule here that a question can only be proper and acceptable if the goal of the question is to purely learn something, when many times a question intended to trap is the most effective way of making a point that really needs to be made. And when people make arbitrary rules, that's a pretty clear sign that there's more going on than they want you to know. I 100% disagree with the coworkers that a question intended to ensnare is improper, since Jesus used that very tactic himself. I will keep saying it on this channel. Saints, this is why you need to test everything the coworkers say and discern whether the statements they are making are valid and should be held to or not. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. As I mention in almost every video on this channel, the coworkers have stated on shepherdingwords.com that Witnessly's teachings are not infallible and that they do not consider them to be infallible. They needed to state that because many people, both from within the local church and from without, have observed that the Lord's Recovery as a group treats Witnessly's teachings as if they are infallible. So my question is this: what do you think Witness Lee got wrong? That question is intended to ensnare, because there's only two ways of answering, in the affirmative or in the negative. They can either answer what they want to answer, which is nothing, he didn't get anything wrong. But that would contradict their statement that his teachings are not infallible. They would then be caught in a lie and have to sit in awkward silence, knowing that doublespeak and following a leader who is considered to be infallible are two telltale proofs of a cult. And by the way, please don't get turned off by the cult word. I don't use it with any intent to be inflammatory, and you can watch some of the other videos on this channel that address it. The other option in this scenario is to give an example of something Witness Lee actually did indeed get wrong, but their words will peter out almost immediately, because the truth is, even if they do actually think Witness Lee got something wrong, well, in the local church you cannot disagree with Witness Lee, because he is indeed considered to be infallible, and this question puts them in the uncomfortable position of facing the fact that there is incredible group pressure in the local church, strong enough to force people to compromise the truth in order to conform. And it also puts them in a state of fear and discomfort because they do not want to be marked out as someone negative, someone who disagrees with Witness Lee's teachings in any way. But they don't want to acknowledge or admit this situation because both of these things, by the way, the unhealthy group pressure to conform at the expense of the truth and the fear of being labeled in this way, are markers of a cult. But all of this is the purpose of the question, because if someone says they are God's deputy authorities and yet are caught in a lie, you want them to be exposed. Or if someone is trapped in a place with double-speaking leaders, unhealthy group pressure, and labeling, you want them to be freed. And asking an ensnaring question like this to show them they are trapped is one of the best things you can do for them. But the coworkers try to prevent these kinds of questionings from being asked in the first place by calling them questionings or improper questions, and we can see why, because no one likes to be caught or exposed, and so they are effectively digging their own traps. And by the way, they are digging your traps too. And so to cope with the discomfort, they point fingers and call people who ask questions divisive or evil or those who sow questionings. Rather than simply face the truth, they spend so much of their time avoiding. On the one hand, I'm sympathetic to some of the coworkers who I believe are themselves trapped in a system they had no intention of being trapped in. On the other hand, some of you coworkers know exactly what is going on, and you participate in this manipulation entirely willingly and with full knowledge. If the coworkers are who they say they are, and they claim to be apostles and deputy authorities of God, then the coworkers should be able to handle being tested, saints. This categorizing of questions being proper versus questionings being improper actually ends up being another incredibly subtle, logical fallacy, implying very sneakily that the way a question is asked or the intent behind the question somehow has the power to negate the validity or truth inherent in the question itself. It doesn't. Someone who has nothing to hide will hear there are questions and respond, "Oh, you got questions? Hit me." Not, "Well, let me write a big article delineating the types of questions I accept, and that I might call your questions improper or questionings or born from a diseased mind," and all those kinds of evasive distractions. So, saints and listeners, no, questions are not of the devil, and yes, of course you can and should ask questions. I would encourage you before the Lord to start asking your questions out loud and to use your sober mind to discern the responses you get. Don't forget, anyone who doesn't want you to ask questions is hiding something. Every time.